What if everything you knew about justice was a lie? If from one day to the next, your life was ripped away from you, your freedom destroyed, your name forever tarnished by a crime that never happened? Imagine spending 40 years behind bars, carrying the weight of an unfair conviction, being called a murderer, betrayed by the justice system, abandoned by your own family. Now imagine that after all this time, an unimaginable truth comes to light. The victim you supposedly killed was never dead. This was Miguel Costa's reality, an ordinary, hard-working man who built his life with effort until on a night that should have been like any other, everything changed. His wife disappeared without a trace. The police were called, searches were carried out, but there was no body, there was no witness, there was no concrete evidence. Just one question that echoed in the newspapers and sensationalist headlines: where is Camila? And that's how the easiest answer became the absolute truth. Without evidence, without time for in-depth investigations, Miguel was named as the culprit. The media made a point of turning him into the perfect villain. The police were under pressure for answers, and the justice system simply ignored everything that could exonerate him. In court, Miguel was not just judged, he was lynched. Looks of contempt, jurors convinced even before the first testimony, prosecutors thirsty for an exemplary conviction. He tried to argue, tried to scream his innocence, but his words were swallowed up by the spectacle that the media and the system had created. The worst part wasn't just the accusation. The worst thing was to look into people's eyes and see only hatred, repulsion, contempt. Those same people who had previously greeted him on the street now looked away, whispering among themselves. Some spat on the ground as they saw him pass by. It didn't matter what he said. He was already convicted before he even stepped foot in the courtroom. Television aired, heated, debates about the mind of a murderer. Psychologists were called in to analyze his stance, and commentators discussed his guilt as if it were fact. For Miguel, this was no longer a trial. It was a public lynching. When the judge banged the gavel and declared his sentence, a certainty took over Miguel. His life had ended there, but there was something that no one expected. A detail that would change everything. Something that would remain hidden for years, until an unlikely piece of the puzzle emerged, revealing the truth that no one had ever imagined. Who really wanted to destroy Miguel? Why would your wife fake her own death? And the scariest thing, who else knew this secret? The answer to these questions will leave you speechless. How many other lives are being destroyed right now without anyone questioning the truth? Miguel lost 40 years because the system chose to condemn rather than investigate. If this revolts you as much as it revolts me, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. Every time this story is heard, the closer we are to preventing injustices like this from happening again. Miguel Costa never imagined that his life could change so drastically overnight. He was a simple, hard-working man, someone who believed that effort and dedication were enough to guarantee a peaceful future. From a young age, she struggled to build everything with her own hands, dedicating herself to hard work and the dream of a stable family. When he met Camila, he thought he had found the missing piece in his life. They got married, built a modest house, planned a future together. In the eyes of their neighbors, they were an ordinary couple, the kind who share laughs at breakfast and make plans for old age. But Miguel didn't know that behind that sweet smile, Camila was hiding secrets that one day would completely destroy him. In the early years, the marriage seemed solid, but little by little, Miguel began to notice subtle changes in his wife's behavior. Mysterious calls, last-minute trips, conversations that ended abruptly as soon as he entered the room. Questions were answered with evasions, and Camila's gaze always seemed distant, as if she was somewhere else, living a life that Miguel had never known. But he didn't want to see the signs. He preferred to believe that it was just stress, that things would go back to normal. He never imagined that, in fact, his wife was planning to disappear and, worse, make him pay for it. Then came that night. Miguel arrived home and found the door ajar. The dinner table was set, but the silence inside the house was suffocating. He called for Camilla, but no answer came. The heart accelerated. Instinct said something was wrong. The house was empty. No clue where she could be. No letter, no message, nothing. Just a disturbing emptiness that grew by the minute. At first, he thought she might have left in a hurry, perhaps to run an errand and would soon return. But as the hours passed and Camilla didn't show up, fear took over. He called friends, her family, the police, and that's when everything started to fall apart. The disappearance quickly turned into a scandal. The media picked up on the case, the neighbors started whispering, the whole city wanted to know what had happened to Camilla. And when the investigations began, Miguel realized that he was not treated like a desperate husband looking for his wife. He was the main suspect. The police officer's eyes, previously full of empathy, began to carry suspicion. Simple questions became interrogations. Words were distorted. His every gesture was interpreted as guilt. And then came the final blow. 3 days after the disappearance, police found bloodstains in the couple's home. Small ones scattered across the bathroom floor. Nothing to prove a violent crime, nothing to confirm a murder. But for justice, that was enough. Miguel Costa, a man with no criminal history and no apparent motive for hurting his wife, was arrested. And from that moment on, your life stopped being yours. He didn't know it, but that would be the last night he would sleep in his own bed for the next 40 years. The noise of sirens cut through the dawn, lighting up the street with red and blue flashes. Miguel was sitting on the couch, unable to sleep for 3 days. Since Camilla's disappearance, his life had turned into a whirlwind of uncertainty. He spent hours at the police station answering questions, searching every corner of the house, retracing his steps in hopes of finding something that would explain where his wife could be. But nothing made sense. Camilla had disappeared without a trace. No letters, no calls, no concrete leads. And then, that night, when the dull knocking on the door echoed through the room, he knew something was about to change. When he opened the door, he saw the police officers standing there, their expressions cold, calculating. There was no empathy, just a silent judgment in each person's eyes. Miguel Costa, you are under arrest for the disappearance and possible murder of Camilla Costa. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The ground seemed to give way beneath his feet. What do you mean, murder? How could they accuse him without proof? But the police didn't want explanations. They brutally handcuffed his wrists and pulled him out as if he were a dangerous criminal, while the neighbors watched the scene in silence, some whispering, others nodding their heads as if they were already sure of his guilt. As he was being placed in the vehicle, camera flashes began. Reporters appeared out of nowhere, as if they already knew that this would be the big headline of the day. Victim's husband arrested as prime suspect. Jealousy and obsession led to crime. The monster everyone knew as an ordinary man. Miguel couldn't believe what was happening. He screamed his innocence, but no one listened. The truth no longer mattered. At the police station, questions were asked, differently now. Before, the police tried to understand what happened. Now they were trying to fit Miguel into the story they had already decided to tell. Where did you hide the body? How long did you plan this? Did Camilla discover something she shouldn't have? He repeated over and over that he didn't know anything, that he would never hurt his wife, that they were wrong. But his arguments hit an invisible wall. The detectives exchanged glances with each other, as if their answers only confirmed what they already believed. Then they presented the supposed evidence, bloodstains found in the couple's bathroom. It wasn't much, just barely noticeable traces on the floor, in the drain, on a forgotten towel. But for the police, that was all they needed. We have evidence that Camilla was injured inside her home. If it wasn't you, who was it? The problem is that no one stopped to question whether that blood was really a sign of a crime or just something common from small, everyday cuts. What mattered was that they now had something tangible to present to the press. Miguel felt his breathing hitch, the head spun. How would they convince a jury with no body, no murder weapon, no witnesses? But he knew the answer. They didn't need to convince anyone. The media would do it for them. In the following hours, his face was on every television, in every newspaper, on every website. Reports talked about his cold behavior, about how he showed no emotion when talking about his wife. Psychologists gave interviews analyzing his profile, stating that his apparent calm could be a sign of sociopathy. Society didn't want concrete evidence. I wanted someone to blame. And now, Miguel was that culprit. The courtroom was packed. The air was heavy, filled with murmurs, accusing glances and incessant camera flashes. Miguel entered, escorted by 2 police officers, handcuffs tight around his wrists, as if he were a dangerous criminal. But the real weight he carried was not the handcuffs, but the judgment that had already been passed before he could even defend himself. Outside, public opinion had already decided his fate. The media built the perfect image of the villain, the possessive husband who killed his wife for not accepting the end of the relationship. It didn't matter that there was no concrete evidence, that there was no body, that nothing really connected Miguel to the crime. The story was already done, and all that was left was official condemnation. The prosecution didn't bother to present evidence. It just reinforced the narrative that everyone wanted to hear. The prosecutor paced back and forth, gesturing dramatically to the jury. This man sat at the dinner table with his wife, looked into her eyes, and that night decided that she would not see the dawn. He didn't need proof. He had emotion. He had an audience hungry for justice, for revenge, for someone to blame. The prosecutor cited the small bloodstains found in the bathroom as if they were the key piece of the puzzle, completely ignored the fact that the blood was never tested with advanced technology to determine if anything was suspicious. The defense tried to argue. He tried to show that there was not a single witness who had seen Miguel commit any crime. He tried to emphasize that Camila could have disappeared of her own free will, that without a body, without a clear crime scene, this was all just guesswork. But each attempt was drowned out by the impact of the show, unfolding before the judges. When the cameras were on, the prosecution spoke louder, more intensely, creating moments of pure theater to ensure that no one doubted Miguel's guilt. The climax of the trial came when they showed Camila's diary. Small notes, loose sentences, outbursts that could have been written by anyone, but were distorted to reinforce the accusation. "Sometimes I feel scared in my own home," one of the passages said. No context was given, no proof that she was actually talking about Miguel. But for the prosecution, this was an indirect confession. "She knew," said the prosecutor, turning to the jurors with an expression full of indignation. "She knew she was in danger, and now she is dead." The jury did not need long to deliberate. The verdict was already decided before the trial even began. When the judge asked everyone to stand, the silence in the room was deafening. Miguel felt his heart pounding in his chest, his breath caught in his throat, as if he were about to be crushed by an invisible weight. And then the word that destroyed his life echoed through the courtroom: guilty. The sound of the hammer hitting the wood was like a nail sealing his fate. Perpetua. No possibility of parole. No chance to start over. Miguel looked around, trying to find a single look that didn't see him as a murderer. But all he found were expressions of relief, satisfaction, people who believed justice had been served. His lawyer put his hand on his shoulder, murmured something about appealing the sentence, but Miguel could barely hear. Everything around him became a blur, a void. The guards pulled him out of the room while the press recorded every second of the man's fall. On the street, a crowd waited outside the court. Screams echoed, some calling for his death, others just watching, absorbing the spectacle as if it were an episode of a true crime show. That night, as the cold cell closed around him, Miguel finally understood. The truth never mattered. The Justice he believed existed was nothing more than a theater where the roles were already distributed before the curtain even opened. He was not convicted of a crime. He was convicted by a well-told story. Imagine being convicted without evidence, without a crime, without a chance of defense. Miguel screamed his innocence for 40 years, but no one wanted to listen. And now, who was really to blame? Just the police and the prosecutor? Or did the media and public opinion also help bury an innocent person alive? Comment here, justice failed, or tell me who should pay for this mistake. I want to know what you think. The cold, damp cell became his world. Miguel could feel the cold concrete beneath the thin mattress, the smell of rust mixed with the sweat of the other prisoners, the echo of screams that never stopped. Inside, time didn't pass. The days were the same. The nights were endless. Hope was something he tried to hold in his hands, but which slipped through his fingers with each new dawn. He wasn't just a prisoner. It was a target, a wife killer, a monster, the type of criminal that not even the inmates themselves tolerated. From day one, I knew I was alone. The guards looked at him with contempt, as if his conviction was something personal to them. The first punch came without warning, in the cafeteria, from a prisoner I didn't even know. The second, in the corridors, when he was pushed against the wall and threatened. The third, in the cell, while trying to sleep. Each attack was accompanied by insults, accusations, cruel whispers saying he deserved worse. He didn't fight back. It wouldn't do any good. He was an innocent man, but inside, no one wanted to know the truth. Days became months. The months turned into years. The seasons changed. The years passed, but within those cold walls, time seemed still. The calendar hanging on the wall of his cell accumulated lines marking the days, but after a while, he stopped counting. What did it matter to know what day it was if each day was the same as the previous one? He wondered if anyone still thought of him out there. Did your story still exist for anyone? Or had he been erased, forgotten, left to die as if he had never existed? Miguel tried to hold on to the only thing he had left, his voice. He would write letters to anyone who would listen. Lawyers, journalists, judges, politicians. He described every error in the trial, every overlooked detail, every piece of evidence that never existed. But the answers were always the same. Silence, indifference, formal refusals. After a while, they even stopped handing them out. The jailer laughed as he tore up the sheets in front of him. "Nobody wants to listen to a murderer," he said. Isolation was his only refuge, but even silence was a punishment. There were nights when Miguel clung to what little sanity he had left, repeating to himself that one day all this would be clarified. But the years passed, and the walls of that cell seemed to close in. More and more, the fear of going crazy was real. Time did strange things to the mind of an unjustly locked away man. He began to doubt even his own memories. "Am I really innocent?" he whispered to himself. Injustice didn't just kill him on the outside, it corroded his soul. He sat in the corner of the cell looking at the bars, imagining what his life would have been like if Camilla had simply gone home that night. What it would have been like to grow old next to her, without knowing the secrets she was hiding. But thinking about it was poison. Anger was mixed with sadness, and the only thing that kept him alive was one question: will someone ever discover the truth? The years passed like a dense, never-ending fog. For Miguel, time no longer made sense. 40 years trapped, forgotten, carrying a weight that wasn't his. But on the outside, something was about to change. The truth, stifled for decades, finally found someone willing to hear it. His name was Daniel Vasquez, a veteran investigator who had dedicated his career to reviewing controversial cases. He had seen it all: miscarriages of justice, hasty convictions, men who died behind bars without ever committing a crime. But Miguel's case was different. There was something strange about him, something that didn't fit. The lack of concrete evidence, the speed with which the trial took place, the lack of an in-depth investigation. And then Vasquez found the first crack in that story. Going through old files, he noticed a disturbing detail. The blood found in Miguel's house had never been analyzed using modern technology. At the time of the conviction, forensics did not have the resources that exist today. They simply assumed that blood belonged to Camilla. But what if it wasn't? What if the only evidence against Miguel was, in fact, a grotesque mistake? With this doubt in mind, he obtained authorization to re-examine the genetic material. And that's when the shock came. The DNA in the blood did not belong to Camilla. In fact, it didn't even belong to a woman, which meant that the main piece that supported Miguel's conviction completely fell apart. If the only evidence against him was a hoax, then what else had they been lied to about? What else had they ignored? The truth was buried, but now it was beginning to emerge, and with it, a frightening question. If Camilla never died that night, where has she been all this time? And worse, who really wanted to bury Miguel alive? The case was about to fall. A part when the most unbelievable revelation of all came from where no one expected it. As Daniel Vasquez continued his investigation, a journalist received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was low, almost a whisper, as if whoever was speaking was afraid of being heard. "You're looking in the wrong place," said the mysterious person. "Camilla never died. She's alive and never wanted to be found." The information was absurd, impossible to believe. But what if it were true? What if the woman whose murder condemned Miguel had never been murdered? The journalist, intrigued, began his own investigation. Following the trail, he checked documents, immigration records, and tracked old bank transactions. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there was still one unanswered question. How had Camilla managed to disappear so completely? Who helped her? The journalist began to suspect that someone very powerful was behind this. If she had done it all, alone, she would have been discovered years ago. Someone protected her. Someone ensured that Miguel was condemned with no chance of defense. But who and why? Daniel Vasquez knew he was close to something big, but with each new clue, his intuition screamed that he was messing with something much more dangerous than he imagined. Some doors simply wouldn't open. Files have mysteriously disappeared. Sources once willing to speak suddenly fell silent. There was someone behind all of this. Someone who wanted Miguel to be buried in that prison. Who could be so interested in hiding the truth? And how far did this conspiracy go? He needed one more piece to put together the complete picture. And this piece would soon emerge from where he least expected it. And then something caught his attention. In a small village in another country, a woman with a completely different identity appeared in the records more than 3 decades ago. Same fake name, same approximate age. But what made the journalist hold his breath was the photo attached to the document. It was her, Camilla, Viva. The search has now become frantic. The journalist traveled to the location and, with a hidden camera, waited. And then, there she was. Older, but clearly the same person. He walked the streets calmly, talked to his neighbors, led a normal life while Miguel rotted in prison for a crime that never happened. The shock was indescribable. What would make a person fake their own death and let someone else pay for it? How could anyone watch for 40 years an innocent man be destroyed without ever trying to right the wrong? The revelation that Miguel was convicted without evidence, based only on assumptions and manipulation, shook the population's confidence in justice. Human rights organizations pressured the government, while experts in criminal law used the case as an example of the danger of trials without concrete evidence. For the first time, justice seemed to be in the dock. But would this be enough to prevent other Miguel Costas from being buried alive by the system? But the scariest question was yet to come. Did she really do it alone? 40 years. An entire life stolen while the truth was hidden in front of everyone. But what's worse? Being falsely accused or being abandoned by those who knew the truth and chose silence. Camilla was never dead, but she never tried to right the wrong. What do you find most unforgivable? Comment here, injustice without forgiveness, and tell me, who should pay for this farce? The prison gates slowly opened, but to Miguel, time seemed frozen. 40 years. 4 decades of pain, humiliation, and loss, all stolen by a lie that had now come to light. The sun touched his skin like something unfamiliar, almost aggressive, and the wind carried a smell of freedom that no longer seemed familiar. Every step outside the prison felt unreal. He had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was here, it was as if he were a stranger in his own body. The streets were different, the people seemed further away. He looked at the buildings and didn't recognize anything. At some point, he realized he didn't even know how to cross a street. The traffic lights were different, the horns were louder. The world had moved on without him. How can someone start over when everything they knew has been erased? Outside, cameras flashed frantically. The same media that destroyed him, that painted him as a monster, now wanted to capture his first reaction upon leaving prison. But what did they expect? Tears, a speech of relief, a thank you? Miguel felt nothing but an overwhelming emptiness. The world outside was no longer the same. The streets had changed, the people he knew had disappeared, and all that was left was a broken man, loose in a society that had already moved on without him. Reporters crowded around him, microphones thrust toward him, questions bombarding his ears. How does it feel to be cleared? What would you say to Camilla? Do you believe justice has failed you? But how do you respond to something like this? How do you explain to someone that freedom, when it comes too late, means nothing? Public outrage was instantaneous. Angry people demanded justice. They wanted to see Camilla and her accomplice pay for what they did. But the system, the same one that condemned him without evidence, now refused to recognize its debt to him: human error. This is how the government defined 40 years of injustice, as if it had been a simple mistake, a slip, something that could be forgiven and forgotten. The compensation claim was rejected. Nothing could make up for what he lost, they said, as if money could erase the fact that his life was stolen from him. Miguel was now a free man, but freedom did not give him back anything he lost. He left prison without a family, without a home, without a purpose. His name was clean in the documents, but it would never be cleaned in the collective memory. For some, he would always be the man accused of a terrible crime. For others, a symbol of a flawed system. But for himself, he was just a survivor of something that should never have happened. But as Miguel tried to rebuild something from the ruins of his life, public pressure finally began to take effect. Camilla was found, arrested, and brought to trial. Her accomplice, the police officer who planted the evidence, tried to escape, but was captured weeks later. This time, the media was not on their side. The world wanted justice, but could their sentences make up for the 40 years stolen from Miguel? The answer came quickly and painfully. No. No sentence could bring back the lost years. No apology could erase the marks of injustice. Camilla and her accomplice were convicted, but even behind bars, they had something that Miguel would never have: time. They knew that one day they would get out of there, while he could never recover his youth, his life, his dreams. What was justice anyway? Just a new verdict. Didn't seem enough. And now, the only question left was, what would Miguel do with this second chance? Miguel walked the streets like a stranger in his own life. People hurried past him, some recognized him, whispered, pointed discreetly, but no one really saw the man he became. For justice, he was a mistake that now needed to be corrected. For the media, a headline that was already starting to lose its impact. For the world, a symbol of fleeting indignation. But to Miguel, he was just a man, with no past, no present, and most frighteningly, no future. 40 years had been lost like smoke in the wind. He never saw his reflection grow old, never felt the touch of a loved one, never had the chance to defend himself when there was still time. Time. That was the real killer of his life. The time that imprisoned him, that forgot him, and that now tried to push him back into the world as if nothing had happened. But something happened, and Miguel felt it in every cell of his body. Camila was still alive. His accomplice was still at large, and while they lived freely all these years, he lived through hell. But now, the story was different. Now, it was Miguel's turn to choose his next move. He could disappear, try to rebuild something on the ashes of his old life, or he could make sure this story didn't end without justice. Because in the end, Miguel wasn't the only one. There were others. Other innocent people buried alive by the system, convicted of crimes they never committed, forgotten in cold cells while the world moved on. How many more would need to scream without being heard? How many would still need to pay for mistakes they never made? The system had failed, but would anyone have the courage to fix it? What if Miguel wasn't the last one? What if, as we speak, other innocent people were rotting behind bars, convicted without proof? Was his case a mistake, or a reflection of a system that would rather condemn than admit its failures? Perhaps the most important question is not who was guilty, but how many more will pay for crimes they never committed? Miguel could just disappear, try to rebuild what was left of his existence. But after losing 40 years, he knew it wasn't just about him. How many others were unjustly imprisoned at this very moment, with no one to fight for them? He couldn't change the past, but he could stop it from happening again. So, he made a choice. Miguel decided that his voice would be heard, and what he was about to do would take everyone by surprise. But would just telling your story be enough? The system that buried him alive for 4 decades continued to operate in the same way, destroying lives in silence. Miguel knew he needed to do more. He didn't just want justice for himself, he wanted to change something forever. Because if justice failed him, how many more lives could be saved before it was too late? 40 years were stolen, but who should really pay for this mistake? Camila, who faked her own death and destroyed a life? The corrupt police officer who planted the evidence? Or the system itself, which condemned without question? But if you think this was the worst injustice you've ever seen, wait until you hear the next story. In the next video, the truth was not just ignored, it was erased on purpose. A mistake that cost more than a life and left scars that were impossible to erase. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and get ready, because what comes next will leave you speechless.